I've always been curious about who I am, not just in the big, existential sense, but in the smaller, more intimate ways too. Like why my heart races when I see certain people, or why I feel this pull towards something I can't quite name. I've never been afraid to ask questions, to explore, to push boundaries, but nothing could have prepared me for him. His name is Marcus, my uncle. He's 45, with graying hair at his temples and a quiet, steady presence that makes you feel safe just being near him. He's tall, with broad shoulders and hands that look like they've worked hard all his life. There's something about him, something guarded, like he's holding back a part of himself. I've always admired him, even when I was a kid. He's the kind of person who listens more than he speaks, and when he does speak, you hang on every word. When he came to visit for my birthday, it had been years since I'd seen him. I was 23, fresh out of college, and still figuring out what I wanted from life. He walked through the door, and I couldn't help but notice how his eyes lit up when he saw me. I hugged him, and for a moment, it felt like he didn't want to let go. I didn't either. That night, after dinner and too many drinks, I found myself helping him to his room. He was unsteady on his feet, leaning on me as we made our way down the hallway. His arm was around my shoulders, and I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. It sent a shiver through me, one I didn't expect. When we reached his room, I helped him sit on the bed, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken, something that made my breath catch. "Good night, Uncle Marcus," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He smiled, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Good night, Jasper." I left his room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Over the next few days, we spent more time together. We went for walks, talked about everything from books to life after college, and slowly, I began to see a side of him I hadn't before. He was more vulnerable than I realized, more unsure. It made me want to know him even more. One evening, we were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a mix of orange and pink, and the air was warm. I turned to him and said, "You know, I've always admired you. You're so steady, but I feel like there's something you're not saying." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might shut me out, but then he sighed and said, "There's a lot I'm not saying, Jasper. Things I've never said to anyone." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I wanted to ask him more, to push him to open up, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded and said, "I get that." It wasn't until the night before he was supposed to leave that everything changed. We were in the living room, the house quiet around us. He was sitting close to me on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. I could feel the heat of his body, the way his breath hitched when our eyes met. And then, without thinking, I reached out and touched his face. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my hand, his eyes closing for a moment. "Jasper," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing." "Neither do I said, "but maybe that's okay." And then I kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, like I was testing the waters. But when he kissed me back, it was like something inside me broke open. All the questions, all the uncertainty, it all melted away in that moment. His hands were in my hair, and mine were on his waist, pulling him closer. It was messy and imperfect and so real. Afterward, we lay together in the quiet, our bodies tangled in a way that felt both new and familiar. He rested his head on my chest, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin. "I've always felt something for you," he admitted, his voice soft. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore it. I held him tighter, my heart aching with a mix of joy and fear. "I don't know what this means," I said, "but I know I don't want to lose you." He looked up at me, his eyes shining. "You won't," he promised. "We'll figure it out together." A few weeks later, Marcus called me. His voice was tense, and I could tell something was wrong. "I have to go abroad for work," he said. "It's a long-term assignment. I don't have a choice." My heart sank. "How long?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "At least a year," he said. "Maybe more." I didn't know what to say. The thought of being apart from him for that long felt unbearable, but I knew I couldn't ask him to stay. This was his career, his life. I couldn't stand in the way of that. The night before he left, we met at a small cabin in the woods, a place we'd talked about visiting together. It was quiet, secluded, and perfect. We spent the evening talking, laughing, and holding each other like it was the last time we'd ever get the chance. "I don't want to lose this," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." He cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "You won't lose me, Jasper. This isn't the end. It's just a pause." We talked about the future, about the things we'd do when he came back. We made plans to visit each other, to stay connected no matter how far apart we were. And then, as the night grew darker, we made love one last time, pouring all our emotions into every touch, every kiss. The next morning, we stood outside the cabin, the sun just beginning to rise. Marcus held me close, his arms tight around me. "I'll call you every day," he promised, "and I'll come back to you, no matter what." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'll wait for you," I said, "no matter how long it takes." He kissed me one last time, his lips lingering against mine, and then he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing there, my heart aching but full of hope. Months passed, and we stayed true to our promise. We talked every day, sharing our lives, our dreams, and our plans for the future. And though the distance was hard, it only made us more determined to make this work. One day, Marcus called me with news. "I'm coming home," he said, "for good." My heart leapt with joy. "When?" I asked, barely able to contain my excitement. "Next month," he said, "and I've been thinking, maybe we could take that trip we talked about, just you and me." I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'd like that," I said, "more than anything." And as I hung up the phone, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Because what we had was real, and it was worth fighting for. Have you ever experienced a connection like this? What are your thoughts on our story? Feel free to share your story. Your voice matters.